Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today or whenever you're watching this. My name is Brian Ullman with the Gem State Chronicle, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Chris Cargill, founder, CEO, and president of the Mountain States Policy Center. Chris, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brian, for having me on.
No problem. I saw Mountain States Policy Center released the 2024 Idaho Poll a week or
Yep.
two ago. And I've been digging into some of the results and thinking about how they're going to affect the upcoming legislative session. But I figured I'd, just ask you on to explain your thoughts on it as well. Uh, First off, just about the poll itself, how do you decide what questions to ask? And were you surprised by any of the results this year?
Yeah, well, I was surprised by some of the results, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today in the program. But Brian, what we do is every other year we do what's called the Idaho Poll, as you mentioned, and it's an opportunity for us to ask questions that we've asked before to see if there's any changes in public opinion, but also ask new questions about issues that are coming up. So, for example, this year. The legislative pay increase is one of those questions that wouldn't have been on there a couple of years ago when we did the last Idaho poll. But we did add it to this one, and we'll talk about some of the results today. But it's something that we hope informs public opinion. We hope informs the media as well to see what Idahoans are thinking, but also legislators. We want legislators to have this information as they go into the session and make big decisions on things like education choice and tax policy and all the other issues that they'll be working on this session. So there were some surprises. We asked about the Snake River dams, and I think the first question, the response to that was a little bit surprising. I was surprised to see, I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised to see such broad support for education choice, specifically the tax credit idea that has been talked about. And perhaps not surprising was that there is a big split on the legislator pay increase piece. So overall, some good data. 800 folks were part of the poll that was done, I believe it was November 26th through December 6th. So about a 10-day period, a 10-day window there, with a margin of error plus or minus 3.5%. And the polling firm that did this polling for us was Scott Rasmussen's new polling firm. So Rasmussen Reports was his previous company. He actually sold Rasmussen Reports. So he's not really involved with Rasmussen Reports anymore. He's got a new research organization called RMG Research that we reached out to conduct the poll. And they do polling in all 50 states. And they did the Idaho poll for us this year. So 2 years from now, when we do the Idaho poll again, Brian, we will ask some of these same questions to see where public opinion might have shifted.
Have you seen any major shifts from the 2022 poll this year?
Not a lot of shifts. I think overall, the one shift that we did see is more broad support for education choice. But what's remarkable is that of that poll, not only from 2022, but also this year in 2024, Brian, is that more people are starting to understand what education choice means. So when we took the poll in 2022, it was about a third of folks didn't really know what education choice was. They had heard maybe of it a little bit, but they didn't have a really good perspective of what it was. Those numbers came down a little bit this year, not surprisingly, since it's been a hot topic both at the state level but also the federal level as well. But I think that was one of the big surprises to me is just there's been a shift in the support for education choice, the knowledge of education choice, and the desire, I think, of not only Republicans, but also Democrats and independents to try to get something done in this next session.
Well, that brings me to the first thing I was going to ask about, and that is education choice. If you're watching this, you can go to mountainstatespolicy.org, and the full report is linked there. And they were also kind enough to share their crosstabs in an Excel spreadsheet. So that's been fun to be digging through the last few days as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, a lot of interesting crosstabs. I mean, you get to see how Trump supporters feel. You get to see how Bernie Sanders type Democrats feel. So that was fun to see some of these crosstabs. Not your necessarily your. Well, you do have your typical crosstabs, which is age and gender and your college level or education level. But you also have some perhaps newer type crosstabs, which I found interesting.
Yeah, I saw there's if you live in a high dense or a medium density area or a low
Yep.
density area,
Yep.
um, how often do you talk about politics? That's
Yep.
an interesting one to
Yep.
see it broke down.
Yep.
Well, here, if it'll come up in a moment, is the responses to this education choice question.
Yeah.
A previous question had mentioned that the state spends approximately $10,000 per student. So this is talking about a tax credit worth about half that, and 66% favor it. And of those, you know, Democrats, Independents, Republicans all favor it as well. Uh,
Yeah. And
you know,
one thing to always look at, Brian, as you know, with these polls is that you look at the intensity numbers. So folks who are strongly in favor or strongly opposed, and the strongly in favor numbers on this are pretty remarkable. 34%. That's a pretty high strongly in favor. So there was five different categories that you could answer this question on. One is strongly in favor, somewhat in favor, and then somewhat opposed and strongly opposed. And then the fifth one was you're not sure, you don't know. And I believe, if I remember correctly, the strongly opposed to this one was pretty small, especially when you compare it to the strongly in favor. And that intensity number is important because it tells you how much support obviously is out there, but intense support that may be willing to go out and speak to their legislator about it, or talk to a local media crew about it, or talk to a family member or a friend about it. If those strongly numbers are high, then that indicates pretty high support.
yeah, see, it looks like 13% strongly oppose it, which is
Yeah.
obviously a much smaller number there.
Yeah, 34 to 13, which is pretty remarkable.
So obviously, last year there was a tax credit bill that was defeated in a House committee.
Yeah.
There's a lot of expectations for this legislature to get a lot of things done, especially school choice. What do you think are the prospects this year, and what kind of bill do you expect to see?
Yeah. Well, first, I think the prospects are pretty good, especially because of what happened during the election. We saw more education choice proponents be elected in this latest round. I do think, Brian, that you're probably going to see three different proposals. What I refer to as the three little bears proposals, which is one is probably going to be too hot, one is probably going to be too cold, and the middle one, which I think is probably going to be the tax credit one, is probably going to be the one that gets settled upon as the vehicle, at least in this session. And when I say too hot, I'm sure there's going to be a proposal out there for an ESA of some sorts. Perhaps it's a $10,000 to $15,000 ESA. And look, if all things were equal, the ESA might be the best way to go, and that would provide the most amount of support for families out there to use that ESA type program. I don't know that an ESA can get across the finish line simply because of the numbers and what the governor will or will not support. So then you've got the $5,000 tax credit, which is kind of the middle option. And then I'm hearing, and I'm sure others are hearing as well, that there may be some sort of perhaps just an extension of the Empowering Parents program, where that will allow folks to, perhaps a smaller number, albeit, but will allow folks to take some sort of credit via Empowering Parents. So again, too cold, perhaps. ESA too hot, perhaps. Maybe the tax credit is the one that is the one to be right in the middle and satisfy the most amount of people. And that's part of the reason why we asked it in this survey.
From an art of the deal approach, obviously,
Yeah,
if you've got
that's
one
right.
on this end and one on this end, depending on how far you pull it, it's where the middle ends up.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be interesting to see where
Yeah.
that goes. Um, let's see. Shifting gears, I have another slide here in just a moment. Number 5. Yeah, so 72% favor requiring a supermajority of 60% to raise taxes for the legislature. Now, I don't see the current legislature considering raising taxes, but it might be a nice fail-safe for the future. Uh, I used to live in Washington, which is another state that Mountain States Policy Center examines.
Yeah.
And I remember citizens using the initiative process to put in a supermajority requirement for the legislature, but they just found ways around it and then
Yeah.
eventually just voted to get rid of it. So, do you think Idaho legislators would be willing to go with this?
Here's the deal, Brian, and I think you recognize this, and others recognize this as well. When you have such strong supermajority support for any issue, or just basically have supermajority in your legislature, you want to try to bank as many different reforms as you possibly can, because as you know, in some of these other states, legislative majorities can change pretty quickly. I mean, it only takes one election cycle for a legislative majority to change. So, to your point, I agree 100%. Is the legislature going to increase taxes tomorrow? No, it's not going to increase taxes tomorrow. But what's it going to do 2 years from now? What's it going to do 4 years from now or 6 years from now? I mean, you could make the argument that California was pretty conservative maybe 40, 50, 60 years ago. And now look at it. I mean, it's a basket case. And so, what we're saying here is that, look, you've got the supermajorities in place to adopt a good taxpayer protection policy. Why not go forward and require a higher burden or a higher threshold to increase the financial burden that you're placing on your citizens? And as you mentioned, would this be something that would stop tax increases right now? Yeah, I mean, not this particular policy, but you just don't have the legislative majorities right now to pass a tax increase. But you may have those majorities in the future. Who knows what will happen uh, 5, 10, 15 years from now? So this puts that in place. And that's why we asked this question as well. And look at these intensity numbers on this one: 45% strongly to 9% strongly. So even more intense on this particular question.
What do you think is the mindset of people who oppose the requiring a supermajority? Why would somebody oppose this idea?
Yeah, I think some people just think it should just be majority rules. I've heard that with so many different times from people who oppose supermajority requirements that, hey, in our, they always say in our democracy, and I put that in quotes, in our democracy, it should only be majority rules. Well, first of all, we're a constitutional republic. We're not a pure democracy. And second of all, there are certain things in our state constitutions that require higher thresholds to pass.
Mhm.
And so you're not doing something that's necessarily unusual. I mean, look at the United States Senate, for Pete's sake. I mean, we've got the filibuster in place, although there are some people who want to get rid of it, but there is the filibuster in place, and it is saying that you have a higher threshold to try to get past the majority rules part of the United States Senate, and supermajority requirements exist in a bunch of different state constitutions. It's not really anything that unusual. It's just a matter of whether you're going to apply it to tax policy.
Well, I know, for local taxes, property taxes, if you're, uh, say, a school district has a levy or bond, that usually requires a supermajority as
Yeah,
well.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah,
Makes
so
sense.
why should it be any different for lawmakers? If you're going to require a supermajority of citizens, why should law I mean, what makes a lawmaker any more special to be able to just do it on a simple majority issue? So that would be our point of view.
Is there any proposed legislation that you know of that we'll see this year for something like this?
I don't think so. I mean, look, it's going to take a constitutional amendment.
Mhm.
You don't want to do it as just a simple policy. I mean, you could do it as just a simple policy, but then a different legislature could come back in and change it. You want to do it as a constitutional amendment, and so hopefully we'll see that happen sooner or later. Whether it will happen soon, it's hard to say. I think there are many other issues that legislators are working on, and quite frankly, it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, Brian, and that is that it's short-sighted. But some people say, oh, tax increases, we don't need to worry about that. The legislative majority is just fine right now. They're not going to increase taxes. Well, you might think that, but wake up 5 years from now and see if that's the same reality.
You want to fix the roof before it stops, right?
Yeah,
Starts raining.
exactly.
All right, bringing up the next one here. The I'm not showing all of them because we'd be here all day, although that would be
Sure.
fun. But for again, viewers can go to mountainstatespolicy.org and see the rest of them. So you did a one asking how people feel about various political figures, President Biden, Governor
Yeah.
Little, and our senators. 30% of Idahoans approve of the way President Biden's handling his job. That's about the same percentage that voted for Vice President Harris. So I guess that's probably your threshold for Democrats in Idaho.
Yep. Yep.
Yet there's only 15 Democrats out of 105 legislators this year, and I think it ties the all-time low.
Yeah.
Looking back the last 30 years or so, what do you know, if you can put yourself in the shoes of Idaho Democrats, what's their role here? What are they going to be able to do?
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, they're not going to be able to do much, obviously. And look, I mean, we see these small majority or the small minorities that Democrats in Idaho have, in Washington and California and Oregon, and well, maybe not so much Oregon, but especially Washington and California. They have really small Republican
Mhm.
minorities, and they can't really do much at all. I mean, look next door in Washington. They're talking about a huge tax increase, a huge budget deficit, and basically Republicans are just going to have to sit in the corner and not really have any say in this process whatsoever. I think, unfortunately, for Democrats, depending on your point of view, um, Democrats are probably going to be in the same pickle in Idaho. They're not going to be able to really impact the process all that much because their numbers are just so small.
Do you think this trend of polarization is just going to continue, where people on the left move from Idaho to Washington or California, and people on the right move to Idaho?
That's a great question too. We were talking with Secretary of State McGrain, and what's interesting on the data of people moving into Idaho is that a good chunk of them, they're not necessarily moving into Idaho to escape um, bad policies. They're conservatives, it, basically moving into Idaho because they want to live in Idaho, they want to be conservative in Idaho, and they don't feel welcome in their states. And so we've always thought that it's an issue of liberals going into Washington or Oregon or California, messing up those states, and then not liking what they did to those states and moving into Idaho and trying to do the same thing. But the data tells us that the majority of people who are moving in are conservatives who are just trying to escape the nonsense that goes on in some of these more left leaning states. So I don't know if I'd say necessarily it gets more polarized, but I do think that it doesn't look like Idaho is going to churn blue, at least not the majority of Idaho, anytime soon. Maybe the Boise area, but that's about it.
Well, even then, it's still hemmed in by Ada County, which
Yeah.
continues to vote red.
Yep. That's right.
Uh, I mean,
But what's interesting, Brian, about that, if I can just mention real
yeah,
quick, is that what we're seeing in Idaho is exactly the opposite of what we're seeing in these other states. So in Idaho, because Democrats don't really have any control in the legislature, or really don't have much of a say, they're using the ballot process. They're using the initiative process to go out there and try to put their policies in place. And doggone it, they were successful on the Medicaid expansion several years ago, which has put the state in a huge budget pickle as far as that particular issue is concerned. Again, that conversation's for another day. But in Washington, it's the exact opposite approach playing out, where Republicans don't have any control in the state legislature, so they are using the initiative process to come in and try to at least adopt some sort of conservative type policies in Washington state. So I guess it just depends on who's in charge at any given time to determine whether it's best to try to go through the legislature or go through the courts and go through the initiative process.
I can speak to the mindset of people migrating, coming from Washington 6.5 years ago. It was before COVID, which really, when that happened, it just confirmed that I made the right choice. But looking around, seeing which way things were moving, I wanted my family and my children to be in a place where most people agreed with the same things we believe, and
Yeah.
our values were respected. And I'm happy to be here.
Yep.
Uh, But you're right about the initiative. I remember in Washington, it was often used by conservatives to
Yeah.
hamstring the legislature or put in place things that the legislature just wouldn't do. And so when I came here, I figured, oh, it must be the same thing. But then I quickly learned that no, it's the opposite.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So you've got, the Reclaim Idaho and some of the other groups basically trying to get policy. They don't like what the legislature is doing. So they're trying to get policy across the finish line via the initiative process. We saw that with Prop 1, of
Mhm.
course, in this last election. We've seen it before. I'm sure we're going to see it again. And I would venture to guess that if education choice passes this legislative session, they might try to throw that on the ballot as a referendum
Mm.
or some sort of initiative to try to block that as well. I mean, look what happened in the legislature. I think it was 2 sessions ago where they tried to put on, or there was some talk about putting an advisory vote on the ballot to determine whether people wanted money going to private schooling. It was a very, very poorly worded type of vote that would have skewed the results. But I think we'll see something like that happen in this next go around. If not from Reclaim Idaho, then maybe another group.
So a lot of folks within the Republican Party are starting to talk about ways to reform the initiative process, with some going so far as to say we shouldn't have it at all because it's direct democracy and we're a representative republic.
Yeah.
Just coming from, I guess, your perspective as someone who's out there seeing where the pulse of people are, uh, where do you think the voting population is on that issue?
That's a good question. And I have to say, I don't know where they are. I think everybody, well, let me put it this way. I think the majority of people think it's important to have some sort of direct access to the lawmaking power of a state. And what I mean by that is that direct, as in they can propose their own laws,
Mhm.
whether it be via initiative process or bill process or what have you. So I think that that part is important. Um, is it is it great to have it just be a situation where you can literally go to 18 different counties, half the counties in the state, and get the numbers that you need and not have to worry about the other 18 counties? Maybe that's not the best process. Every state does it differently, as you know, Brian. I mean, some states have a process. Nevada has a process whereby you you have to get two affirmative votes. So you go out, you go. Let's do an initiative for example. You have to get an affirmative vote in one election, and then it's got to go back on the ballot in the next election, and you have to get an affirmative vote in that election as well. So
Hmm.
that's an interesting process that goes on in Nevada that maybe is a tool that Idaho could use, to where you have to get voters to approve it twice to eventually, essentially say to voters, "Are you sure? You already said yes on this. Are you sure you want to do this?" So, I mean, that could be one way to do it. I've seen proposals as well to require there be a certain amount from every county in the state. So maybe that's a good way to do it too. But I do think overall, voters, no matter who's in the legislature, voters still want to have some sort of direct access to be able to propose or implement laws on their own. And it's a check and balance, I think, for them.
So moving to my next slide here, you asked about all the the different elected officials. But before I go into the question, I found it interesting looking at the crosstabs that there were a lot of people who were not sure of their opinion on our senators or our governor.
Yeah.
Nobody, 1% was not sure about President Biden. I guess that
Yeah.
just shows what national news and how that pervades
Yeah.
everything.
Oh, 100%. You go out and you ask the average person on the street, "Hey, who's your senator or who's your governor?" Some people will know, but not everybody knows. Some people are really clueless, and you especially start getting down to congressmen or your state representative or your state senator, and you see the numbers of not knowing people just keep going up and up and up. So I'm not surprised necessarily to see any of these numbers. I do think it's a little bit interesting that Senator Risch and Senator Crapo didn't hit the 50% mark. But again, at the same time, a lot of folks just say they just don't have an opinion on
Mhm.
these particular ones, but they certainly have an opinion on President Biden. That's for sure.
Well, you did ask the questions right here after the election during the, when President Trump is choosing his cabinet people. And so the national news is all about the Senate and are they going to confirm
Yeah.
them? So there was a little more attention than usual
Yeah,
on the
that's
Senate
true.
now.
Yep.
Governor Little, he has a 57% approval rating right now, which
Yep.
is pretty decent. I know a lot of conservatives have not forgiven Governor Little for the stay-at-home order and all the state of emergency stuff. It wasn't enough to stop him in 2022, and I think if he ran again in 2026, he would likely win.
Yeah.
Do you think he runs?
That's a political handicap question that I don't really know the answer to. I wish I knew. It would certainly make our job in terms of policy research a lot easier. But I just don't know. I don't know if any of these folks keep running. Maybe you start to see it turn over here in the next couple of election cycles. I know there's certainly a lot of people on the bench waiting to jump
Mhm.
in. That's for sure. But I'm not sure of these three if they keep going. I did ask Senator Risch an interesting question when he was at our an event in Coeur d'Alene that we did a couple of years ago. I said we were talking about President Biden's age, and I said, "Is 84 years old or however old Biden was at that time too old to be an elected official?" And he said, "Hell no." And he may have been talking about himself as well there because he's getting up in age, and I think both. I will tell you, both Risch and Crapo, and especially Risch, they certainly don't act their age in terms of their work ethic. I mean, it's hard to go back and forth to DC every single week and be on a plane and running from meeting to meeting. So I don't envy their schedule, and they certainly portray themselves to be much younger than perhaps they really are.
Yeah, it's one of those conundrums of our system that as long as the voters keep returning our elected
Yeah,
officials, then that means they are representing us and they have the confidence of the majority of the people.
exactly.
On the other hand, you see jokes like the Babylon Bee talked about having life alert buttons at the on the Senate
That's
floor now.
right. That's right. That's right.
Mm,
I've always been of the opinion that look, I'm not a huge fan of term limits because I think the people are the folks who are deciding what those terms should be, and if the people don't like an elected official, they should be able to kick them out at any time, and they shouldn't be forced necessarily to kick anybody out.
mm.
But yeah, I definitely think we could definitely see in the future, or need in the future, some new blood, some younger folks coming in and perhaps leading the country as well.
It is interesting. I'm just old enough to remember when President Clinton was elected, the first baby boomer president in
Yep.
1992, and he was a young. It was kind of like a JFK moment, passing the torch to a new generation, and now here we are. By 2028, assuming nothing happens, we'll still have a baby boomer president.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I saw a graphic that showed that Clinton, Bush, and Trump were all born in the same year.
Mhm.
What year was it? 44?
46, I believe.
46. All right. Yeah. So that's pretty remarkable that they're basically all the same age. And yet, that generation hasn't given up yet, I guess.
Definitely left its mark on our country.
Yes, for sure.
So next slide here, 82% agreed with your proposal for school districts to have key budget items and performance on page one of their budgets. I was reading this about this, but can you tell
Yeah.
the people about the Public School Transparency Act?
Yeah, so this is an idea that we came up with a couple of years ago. If you've ever tried to read a school district budget, Brian,
Mhm.
I mean, it's like trying to read Chinese. It's very, very difficult to understand. I mean, they're hundreds of pages long, and they've got all these different budgets and supplemental budgets, and this fund and that fund. And if you're just your average mom or dad, you're taking your kids to soccer practice. One, you don't necessarily have the time to go through hundreds of pages to understand what your school district is doing. And two, even if you did have the time to go through it, it'd be hard to understand what the school district was doing. And so, what we have recommended is that on page one of all the school district budgets, they be required to all report the same thing. And so, how much money they have to spend, how much they're paying their teachers, how much they're paying their administrators, what the what the teacher to student to administrator ratios are, how much money's getting to the classroom, those type of things. And then you could go in and instead of reading the whole budget, you could just look on page one, let's say of the Boise School District's budget and say, okay, Boise School District does it this way. Okay, and now I'm going to look at page one of the Idaho Falls School District budget. Idaho Falls does it this way. Okay, here's page one of the Coeur d'Alene School District budget. Coeur d'Alene spends perhaps more on teacher salaries and less on, administrator salaries, whatever the case might be. But the point here is that it makes it easier for the public to understand what their school districts are doing and to be able to compare and contrast with other school districts in the state. Especially if you're moving from one school district to the other, you want to be able to go in and get a good understanding if you're sending your kids to public school, how much money the school district has and where that's going and what their teacher retention rates are. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to do that unless you have this information. So I would just point out that only 9% oppose this. I haven't met anybody so far who has opposed it. 3% strongly. So we're talking about overwhelming support for this concept, which is really just a good government type concept. I mean, it's not a game of gotcha. The school districts know all this data. The school districts have all this data. It's in their budgets. They could produce it in an hour if you ask them to. But I mean, it's very comfortable for them to just throw the 500-page budget on the website and call it a day. And unfortunately, that just doesn't work for the majority of folks who are out there.
Is it really transparency if the things they're being transparent about are not really comprehensible to the
Yeah,
average person?
that's exactly right. I mean, go if anybody's watching this has time, go on to the West Ada School District's budget and read it. It's about 500 pages long, and see if you understand if you can make heads or tails out of whether they have the amount of money that they need to operate, whether they're paying teachers correctly, whether they're spending money in wrong places, whether they have enough teachers, whether they have too many teachers. I mean, you can't make heads or tails out of it by just reading it. And so this just requires it all be put in one place, page one of everybody's budget, and then you let the public read it and understand it and compare and contrast.
That's one of those things where I think AI is getting to the point where it might be able to help. We saw
Yeah.
yesterday as people were feeding that 1,500-page continuing resolution into various LLMs.
Yeah.
I saw the Mountain State's Twitter account was posting yesterday or today, I don't remember, about the committee on AI that met earlier this week and how
Yeah.
state governments are using that to automate certain things. I don't know if I really have a question, but I can foresee, being able to just have some government AI system that's just all it knows is all those government documents, all those transparency things, and you just ask it questions. All right, what is the student or staff to student ratio at West Ada School District?
Right. Yeah, I would hope that eventually we can get to that point as well. I had some folks last year when this was first proposed say to me, well, I don't necessarily favor that because that's something that the school districts should already be doing. And they're right. I mean, the school district should already be doing that. The problem is they're not. And so unless you have some sort of mechanism in place to require them to do it, unfortunately, I don't think that they will do it. I wish we had school districts who would just voluntarily do it. And we're going to put out the first publication on this probably in January or February, which will have all the data points and serve hopefully as a model for what it should look like. But it's unfortunate that we can't get the school districts to just do it on their own. I wish we could. But as far as the AI portion, 100% agree, Brian. We're going to be launching a tool probably the first of the year called Wonk, which will read through every piece of legislation that's introduced in the legislature and give you a plain English explanation of what it would do, and then like 4 or 5 bullet points so that you can understand it without having to read through 100 pages of the bill or however long the bill might be. This is something that's only been done in one other state, in Illinois, in the last legislative session. And it's not going to be foolproof. There will be things at the very beginning as the AI tool starts to work and recognize what certain things are. But I would bet you about 95% of what it puts out there will be accurate and will be instantaneous as well.
That's actually an idea I've had. I just to sick an AI on all the legislation.
Yep.
I don't have the know-how to do it, so I haven't really
Neither do
known where to
I.
start. But
I'm dependent on our tech folks to figure all that stuff out.
well, I'm glad to see that it's going to be out there. Will it be able
Yeah.
to do answer more questions such as, how did so and so senator vote on everything?
I'm not sure about the voting, but it will be able to answer questions on the bill itself. So,
Mm.
you go in and let's say you want to read House Bill 100, for example, and it'll give you 4 or 5 bullet points, and then you can ask it a question on what that bill would do. So, let's say the 4 or 5 bullet points didn't satisfy what your question was. You could ask it a follow up question, and it will try to answer them. And then it will also keep track of the number of bills. That's the other thing that's kind of interesting. In Idaho, we talk about the fact that, hey, there's 600 or 700 bills, and gosh, that's a lot of legislation. I mean, in Montana, last legislative session they had 1,700 bills.
Wow.
Washington had like 3,400 in their last session. So, 700 is not something to sneeze at, but it's a lot better, I guess, than some of the other states.
Will it also be trained on existing Idaho code so you know how
Yeah.
the new bill will interact with it?
Yeah, yeah, but it's interesting that you asked that because that's one of the issues as we've been kind of beta testing it here over the past couple of months is training it to figure out how it interacts with Idaho code. So that takes time, obviously, and as the robot, and again, I'm not an AI expert, but from what I understand, as the robot kind of goes through the process and learns what Idaho code is, it can better answer those questions that are really into the weeds, the nitty gritty. So eventually, yes, I'm not sure if it'll do it right away, but eventually it'll get there.
Well, I am really excited about that. I
Yeah,
hadn't heard that before, so I'm looking forward to
yeah,
checking it out.
yeah, it'll be cool.
So, moving on to this question. Yeah, work requirements for Medicaid. This is obviously something that seems to come up every year. 63% say yes, including 58% of Democrats.
Yes, that
Which
that surprised me. Yep.
So I have two questions about this, and the first is just why hasn't the legislature been able to enact something that is broadly popular like this?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. And I think, as you said, this is something that's come up in previous years. I think it will come up again this year. And I know at least one legislator who is going to be trying to introduce something on it this year. But yeah, I don't know why they haven't done something like this and put this in place. I think there will be a lot more momentum for this in the coming year, especially with all the things that are going on with the Doge and everything else, and trying to just streamline government. But yeah, I was shocked at the crosstabs of this as well. I mean, I expected 71% support among Republicans, but it really surprised me that more Democrats than independents were in favor of it. So very interesting numbers. Again, a super majority, 63% over that 60% threshold, and majority support among those three different demographics. There really should be no reason to not move forward on that. And look, this all ties back to the Medicaid expansion that was on the ballot that voters approved that is now costing the state a huge amount of money because of that requirement. So if you can put some work requirements in place, that might help alleviate some of that.
Um, Going beyond just work requirements, my old boss Wayne Hoffman, I'm sure you know him.
Yes.
He recently wrote. He said that work requirements aren't enough. He called it boring because it's something we're talking about, always talking about. But he suggested that welfare benefits as a whole are really detrimental to not only the human spirit but our community. Kind of go into a deeper level there. So I'm just wondering, is there a path to unwinding any of these benefits that are now in place, especially Medicaid expansion or the Medicaid system as a whole?
Oh, I definitely think there is a path. Is there an appetite? I think is the better question. And the appetite may not be there. And the reason for that is because unfortunately it all comes down to PR. It all comes down to PR. If you're seen as wanting to put, work requirements, for example, on Medicaid benefits, the one side or another says, "Oh, you're heartless," or "Oh, you want to do this and you want to feed grandma dog food," and it's the same thing that's happening, Brian, with this issue about whether to get rid of the federal Department of Education. You say, yeah, let's get rid of the federal Department of Education. Well, why do you hate kids so much? I mean, that's the type of situation that we're in, where there's really just no logical discussion or in-depth discussion about whether the federal Department of Education actually helps educate kids.
Mhm.
And it really doesn't. You could get rid of the federal Department of Education and just block grant that money to the states if you wanted to, and save yourself a bunch of overhead. And I bet you the results would improve because it would be at the state level.
For
But
sure.
instead, what's happening is you say you want to get rid of the Department of Education. Well, why do you hate schools? Why do you hate education? And so it all depends on the PR. I think it all depends on how you go out and you sell the reform. And unfortunately, with the way some media is, not all, but the way some media is, you propose any type of reform to any of these things, and you just get painted as this heartless person. And that's really, really difficult for some legislators, for some lawmakers to get over. They don't want to. They don't. They're worried about their reelection. They don't want to face the heat for some of those things.
I remember last session, Representative Jordan Redmond brought forth a bill
Yeah.
that would have put guardrails on Medicaid expansion for
Yeah.
able-bodied adults, and people were lined up out of the committee hearing room to share why, if they lose this benefit, they'll die,
Yep.
basically.
Yep.
And it's a very emotional issue, and it's hard to stand up and be stoic about it.
Well, exactly, and that brings me up to one of the other questions that we asked in the poll, and that was whether there should be adequate public notice before you hold a hearing on a bill. Because you're exactly right. What ends up happening is let's say there's a hearing on Medicaid expansion. Everybody and their brother who cares about that issue, who is maybe involved in their local union or some activist group, they all show up in red t-shirts or green t-shirts or white t-shirts or whatever, and they all testify, they all say the same thing, they pack the hearing room. Well, what about the average Joe who's running his business? Well, first of all, he only got maybe 24 hours notice to go and testify, and second, he doesn't have time to go and testify on the bill. And so he depends on an email or on maybe on a phone call. What we're suggesting with what's on the screen there is that you require 3 days public notice for a hearing. And look, if you're living in downtown Boise, maybe you don't need the 3 days public notice. Maybe you can just drive straight over to the Capitol, not have a problem. But if you're living in Idaho Falls or Pocatello or Sandpoint or Coeur d'Alene or wherever, you can't make it down to the Capitol with 12 hours notice. You got to have a little more time.
Mhm.
And so we really think the legislature should adopt what we call the rule of three, which is that you have to have a 3 day period, A, to give legislators a chance to read the bill, for Pete's sake, and then B, to give folks the opportunity to go and testify if they want to do that.
Have you gotten any pushback on this idea from legislators or committee chairs who are the ones who schedule these things?
We have, yes. I mean, I've had some of them say it sounds like a great idea as soon as I leave the legislature. So, and I understand their point. I mean, it puts some, as you mentioned earlier, puts some guardrails on what they can and can't do. You can't push something through with no notice. But I think that's kind of the point. That's
Mhm.
that's exactly what we're trying to say, is that there should be guardrails on this. The public should have adequate notice to be able to read through these things. And maybe the compromise here, Brian, is that okay, you put this policy in place, but you give the legislature an out. So maybe it's a supermajority requirement to suspend the rules and move it forward with less than 3 days notice.
Hmm.
Maybe it's something like that, to where, okay, if it's an emergency or something's going on and they got to hold a hearing to get it to the floor, okay, then maybe the majority of the super majority of the legislature could come in and say, we're going to suspend that rule to advance it. But if it's January or February and you're in the middle of the legislative session, there really should be no reason why you can't have 3 days public notice. It's just a good government proposal, and it should be something that's in place.
Um, yeah, you were talking about how if you live in Boise, you don't need that 3-day notice. And
Yeah.
turns out a lot of the people who live in Boise are the activists on perhaps the left side of the spectrum who
Exactly.
are accustomed to coming in and testifying on bills.
Yeah, I mean, and we've seen them all the time. I mean, you've been in the hearing rooms before, and they'll pack the hearing rooms, and it's they read the same script. It's over and over and over again, and it's all the same people, and that's fine. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be able to testify. Everybody should be able to
Mhm.
testify, but you give those folks an advantage by not requiring the 3 days notice, because then they can just call upon their groups, their activists, their other folks who can come and pack the room. And then the folks who maybe have to pay the bill, the small business owner who lives 100 miles away from the Capitol, you basically shut him out of the process. And we shouldn't be doing it that way.
Yeah. No, that's seems common sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another issue you asked about is one that I've seen bandied back and forth: the voters guide. Coming from
Yeah.
Washington State, they had a voters guide, so I just thought it was normal, and then I come here and it's not there.
Yeah.
But I know Secretary McGrain has been long pushing it. But some critics say that it could unfairly disadvantage new challengers, people who file right at the last minute. They don't have their bio ready, or they are not used to the process, as well as maybe it being a competition with private sector voter guides. Those are some of the other side that I've read.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what a voter's guide is or what it would do. I mean, a state voter's guide wouldn't necessarily be, Phil McGrain or other state officials writing out the guide and telling you, who's running for this office or who's running for that office and who's better here, who's better there. It actually is just the opportunity for the candidates to submit their picture and their background and the purpose for them running. Um, into a guide that would then be printed and sent out. So there's nobody's going to be putting their thumb on the scale here. You basically, everybody has to submit the same size of picture, the same um, word limits on why you're running for the office, the same word limit on your educational background or your community service, and then the state prints that. So the state can't edit it. The state doesn't go in and say, hey, this guy sounds like he doesn't know what he's talking about on this particular issue. We should edit this. They print what you send them. And so, to your point, Brian, about Washington, some people forget to submit their voters guide stuff, and if that happens, then it just goes out with blank spots essentially, and says, okay, Joe Smith is running here, but he didn't submit anything on this. He didn't submit anything on this, and didn't submit anything here. I think this could particularly help Brian with the judicial races,
Hmm.
because people, and you probably get questions all the time as well. People are always calling us saying, "Who are these people running for judge? Who's this person? Who am I supposed to vote for?" Well, at the very least, a voter's guide would at least put that in front of you. And yeah, it's written by the candidate, but at least you get to see their picture and have their educational background. And maybe you put endorsements on there. So if some person is endorsed by a bunch of unions, then that might tell you something. If some person's endorsed maybe by the Home Builders Association, that might tell you something. At least it gives voters a little more information. And so I understand the concern about this, but I think people need to understand that if this were to happen, again, it's not the state that's going to be writing it. The candidates write it. The state
Hmm.
just prints it.
Hmm. Well, I'm sure we'll see that one again this year.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Yep.
All right. One more question about the poll, and then I've got, as time permits, a few rapid fire
Sure.
questions. Grocery tax, big
Yeah.
issue. It's not, and I've written about this many times. It's not that much money, but it's a big symbolic issue, I think,
Yeah.
that
Yep.
conservatives have been fighting to do for a long time. And 87% favor exempting groceries from the sales tax, 63% strongly. I don't think there's any other question on there that had that much. So, well, maybe the truth in taxation here, but it's
Oh,
one of the higher
three
ones.
days. Yeah, 3 days
Yeah,
notice was the other
3
one.
days one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your Mountain States Policy Center has written about this and has recommended raising the grocery tax credit rather than eliminating or exempting groceries from sales tax. So on this issue, why not give the people what they want and just get rid of those taxes?
Yeah, which we certainly could. I mean, that's a very valid question, a valid point. I mean, if tomorrow the legislature were to come in and say, "Hey, let's get rid of the grocery tax," that's just fine. The only caveat to that I would put is that if you're only going to choose one tax, let's say, to reduce, you can get more bang for your buck by reducing the income tax than you can reduce by reducing the grocery tax. And so that's the point that we're trying to make with this, is that it's not that we oppose getting rid of the grocery tax. If the legislature wants to get rid of the grocery tax, fine. A lot of other states don't have taxes on groceries and don't necessarily even have a sales tax. But our point is that if you're going to choose one or the other, you can get a much better bang for your buck on the income tax. And think about it from this perspective. We don't know the exact amount, but a good chunk of the grocery tax comes from people who come in from out of state. So uh, they're paying for basically Idaho government via the sales tax. Whereas the income tax, of course, only comes from people who are essentially working in Idaho, who are the families in Idaho. And so from our perspective, if you get rid of the grocery tax completely, you're basically giving up on that revenue that's coming in from out of state. And so what we would rather see is you increase the rebate on the grocery tax, which again only applies to folks who are living in Idaho, and then you increase or decrease, I should say, the income tax rate. And from our perspective, we would like to see the income tax um, uh, have a what's called a trigger mechanism in place to where the income tax would automatically go down every time state revenue went up. And why is this so important? Well, the reason why is because right now at 5.8%, Idaho's income tax is getting dangerously high in terms of how you compare it to the other states. So Arizona just lowered their income tax, Brian, to 2.5%. Iowa's lowering their income tax to 4.8. Utah lowered theirs to 4. Montana's lowering theirs to under 5. So from our perspective, at 5.8%, the income tax in Idaho vis-a-vis the other states, we're dangerously approaching a situation where we're going to have one of the highest income tax rates in the country if we're not careful. And so we would rather see the income tax come down and the grocery tax rebate go up, as opposed to just getting rid of the grocery tax altogether.
Do you expect to see another income tax reduction this session?
Well, I expect to see another proposal. I'm not necessarily sure that there are the votes in place to make it happen, but I guess we'll wait and see on that. But I definitely think we'll see some sort of proposal. And look, every 0.1% of the income tax is about $40 million. So I mean, you just do the quick math, and you could lower the income tax pretty quickly, and then especially in a time when so many of the more progressive states are increasing their income taxes, and Washington next door is increasing its capital gains income tax. You really have the opportunity to attract a lot more revenue to your state by lowering that income tax rate.
Hmm. Yeah, I brought up the graphic here of which tax impacts your family the most. It was really interesting looking at the crosstabs of this one,
Yeah.
where older people, by a great majority, were mostly concerned about the property tax, whereas younger people were much more concerned about the income tax, which
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. The other interesting part about this, Brian, is that, of course, Idaho doesn't have a state property tax.
Mhm.
And so, the local property taxes, yes, they're a burden, but I think sometimes the anger on property taxes is misplaced. People say to the legislature, "Hey, property taxes are too high. You guys need to do something about that." Well, if you want to know why property taxes are too high, in many ways, in some cases, in many areas, you got to look in the mirror, because you're the one that's electing people that are raising property taxes and
Mhm.
increasing property taxes, or maybe you're the one that's passing the latest school bond or levy and that's increasing your property tax. I mean, the state legislature really doesn't have a lot to do with property taxes. And it was a good thing that property tax that the legislature helped lower property taxes a few years, or in the last session, with some of their proposals.
Mhm.
The bad part about that is that you potentially are sending the signal to the local governments that, hey, you don't need to worry about spending, just keep increasing your budgets and keep asking for more and more and more, and we'll come in and fill it on the back end. Which is part of the reason, Brian, that we're recommending the truth in taxation policy, to make it so that legislators, or excuse me, local lawmakers have to go out and talk to their constituents about why they're increasing their spending, and therefore increasing the burden that they're going to place on homeowners with their property taxes.
I know down here, most taxing districts do have public hearings before they raise their taxes. Just
Yeah.
people aren't aware of them. You mentioned
Yep.
how most people hear national news and they forget that they have state legislators and governors and things. It's even more so trying to figure out who your county council members are, or your city
Yes.
council,
Yep.
county commissioners, or fire district. I'm looking at my, I just got my property tax the other day.
Yep.
Ada County, Eagle Fire, Ada County Highway, Eagle City, West Ada School District, all those things. And that's all there. It's out in the open. It's just not enough people are aware of it and take the time to
Yep.
actually go and weigh in.
Well, which is what truth in taxation would require. So truth in taxation would say to the local governments, each year, if you're going to propose a budget that's going to require an increase in taxes, you have to send out a postcard to all of the people who are going to be subject to that increase,
Hmm.
and explain to them that it's going to be, let's say a 20% increase, and we're going to hold a hearing on it at, let's say, City Hall on Tuesday at 5 p.m. And guess what ends up happening, Brian, in states that do that? Mysteriously, the numbers start to go down because people see that and they say, oh my gosh, my local government is coming in and they want to increase their spending by 25%, and that's going to cause my property tax to go up by 1,000. And they end up showing up at the meeting, and they end up telling their local lawmakers what they think. So this policy has been in place in Utah for quite some time, and what we've seen since it was put in place is that the numbers start to come down a lot more, because there's a lot more attention and there's not a lot more people highlighting what their local governments are doing.
Well, we are reaching the end of the hour. I'm going to have to skip a few questions. I know there's some interesting stuff about the Snake River dams on there that is going to require some additional attention, and some things about federal lands that I was going to ask. But you've been more than generous, so I want to respect your time.
I've still
Last,
got about 10 or 15 minutes, Brian, so fire
oh,
away.
okay. Well, in that case, I will take advantage of that.
Sure.
Let's ask about the dams.
Yeah.
That's been a contentious issue, and had I just gone by what I've heard, I'd figure most people oppose breaching the dams. But your poll says that's not the case. What's going on?
This is one that surprised me. I was not necessarily expecting to see this. I would point out what is on the screen there. The strongly numbers basically match each other, which is interesting. But I think, and Brian, I don't know if you looked at the crosstabs of this one. What was interesting to me is that the men favor getting rid of them, the women don't. And that may be the fishing effect that is out there. I don't know. I'm just guessing here, but I think it's really easy to say that you favor getting rid of the dams, and then if you go on to the next question, you ask folks about, what's more important to you, the steelhead and salmon population, or is it the economic advantages that come with having dams, and the numbers basically just flip. So what I think is happening here is that people aren't really aware of the benefits necessarily that the dams provide, not only in there it is right there, not only in electricity, but also economics, to especially to the port of Lewiston and other parts of Idaho as well. When they learn about that, of course, they're more skeptical about getting rid of the dams. But I did think that first question, to just kind of lay it out there and see what the general consensus was an interesting one. But I bet you, Brian, if you asked a follow-up question about how many dams are actually on the Snake River that would be impacted by this, I bet you no one could answer that. And it's 4, but I bet you most people wouldn't know the answer to that. So it's really easy to say, yeah, let's get rid of the dams, and then just not know how many dams we're talking about.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something that seems like there's a few people that have strong opinions about, and they're knowledgeable, and then most people, it's just something that they might see a headline now and then.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, the dams that we're talking about here aren't, of course, in Idaho. They're in Washington State. So, but it does impact Idaho. As I mentioned, it impacts the Snake River, of course. It impacts the port of Lewiston, and it would have a devastating impact on the state. But I just don't think enough people pay attention to it.
Maybe I'll have to dig in and research and write something about it, and
Yeah.
if nothing else, to educate myself.
Yeah, it's an very, very interesting, and it provides about 10% of the region's electricity as well. So we got to be careful, of course, because we've not in Idaho, but we have other nearby states who are requiring everything be electrified, and the more you do that, the more energy you need, of course. And they're not really they're doing one thing, but they're not doing the other in terms of trying to expand the use of hydropower.
Hmm. Along those kind of a similar subject, I was looking at your policy wish list, which came out after the poll is, and things you want to see the legislature promote, and that's also on the mountainstatespolicy.org.
Yeah.
You mentioned calling for more control of more state control of federal land, and this is an ongoing discussion. You've got that Utah lawsuit asking the Supreme Court to rule. And I've heard different sides of this. A lot of conservatives want to see the state take over those lands to better manage it, whether it's for forest fire management or just more beneficial uses. But then others say, wait a second, if the state takes it, then there's a danger that they'll sell it off for development, or that they'll change its use. A lot of hikers and hunters and fishermen are a little worried about that. And then there's the whole legal question. Colton Bennett, who ran for state legislature this year, he just posted a video on X, pretty clearly laying out that in the Enabling Act that allowed us to become a state and our state constitution, we essentially said the federal government is going to keep those lands. So where do you see this whole thing going forward in the next few years?
Well, from the good point of view is that we've got a new administration coming in who is, I think, much more eager to try to get issues back to the states. So that is a positive. The way it's set up right now, Brian, is that, of course, the federal government controls these lands. It's about 65% of the land in Idaho. In some of the other states, it's a lot more than that. And mostly it's the western states that the federal government controls all this land in. I mean, in some states, it's upwards of 90% of the land is controlled by the federal government. The issue, Brian, is that the federal government does a terrible job of keeping those lands up. And as a result of that, in the summer, we get all these forest fires from lands that were basically just not managed whatsoever. It's basically a tinderbox out there. Especially in states like Washington and some parts of Montana and others as well. And it makes it really difficult. Yeah, that map. Look at the map there. I mean, Nevada basically is all federal land. I mean, it's up more than 90%. Alaska is another example. Look at how much Idaho is as well. So the question is, who does the best job in terms of keeping the land at least somewhat cleared so that it doesn't become a fireplace? And the answer to that question is actually, Brian, surprisingly enough, the tribes. The tribes do the best job. The tribes are you could literally fly over a good chunk of the land and see exactly where tribal land begins and where it ends, and where federal land begins and where federal land ends. The tribes are the ones that do the best job. But the states do a much better job than the federal government does. The federal government just basically lets it burn and lets it have overgrowth and makes it into a very, very dangerous situation that results in some of the large wildfires that we've seen. So our hope is that eventually, and we're not necessarily talking about giving up the land for development or for private use, but making it so that the states can at least manage that property and make it at least somewhat safer for a lot of the folks who live in those states. And as you saw on the map there, it's not just an Idaho issue. It's an issue all over the West.
Yeah, the mountain states.
Yeah, and Kathy, the comment from Kathy is that the best stewards are the people. Yeah, exactly. They're the ones who are the best stewards. They're the ones that come in and take care of the land because they live there. They have an incentive to do that. The folks in Washington, D.C., the bureaucrats, are not the best folks to make that happen. And it's just really disappointing that the federal government doesn't recognize that. Hopefully, as I mentioned, with the new administration, maybe we'll see some of that return to the states, like we were talking about with the Department of Education earlier. Maybe we'll see some of this control return to the states, because I would guess that the states could do a much better job taking care of it. And what I mean by the states is the people in those states
Yeah.
can do a much better job taking care of it than the federal government.
Well, again, I appreciate your time. I wanted to wrap up with just a question about Mountain States Policy Center itself.
Yeah.
Uh, on the one hand, I think the Republican Party that's forming now, with the Trump movement, the MAGA movement, it's a little more populist, maybe a little more socially conservative in some areas, and less in others. So you're dedicated to free markets. Where do
Yeah.
you see your role going forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're an economic based think tank. I mean, so if you've heard of the American Enterprise Institute, or the Cato Institutes, the Heritage Foundation to a lesser extent, but I mean, those are the national think tanks. We're a think tank on a local level, so we do a lot of those same type of things just on the local level. Based here in Idaho, as you mentioned, Brian, we cover Montana and Wyoming and parts of Washington as well. And our goal is to basically to provide the details, to provide the research, to provide the recommendations. We're not going to tell you how to vote. We're not going to tell legislators how to vote, but we will tell you what we think is the best policy. I mean, that's our job. And so we show up at if we're invited, we'll show up at the legislature and we'll testify why education choice is a good policy, or we'll tell you why we believe that the tax policy here or federal land policy there would be a better policy. But we're not there to tell you how to vote. We're not in the public sphere to tell you how to vote. We believe that you'll make a good decision if you have all the research and you'll have all the data in front of you. And our job is to get that research and data out to as many folks as possible. So that is our role in kind of the lexicon. And I will tell you, in Idaho, it's all the more important because our legislators, they don't have staff, they don't have research teams. It's just them. And so, to the point that we were making earlier, Brian, about all the folks who show up in the hearing rooms, and everybody's wearing red shirts or white shirts or green shirts, and they're all saying the same thing. If that is all the legislature hears, it can be very tempting for a legislator to just vote that way. They need to have other groups. They need to have other information put out there, like the information that we put out. And there's other organizations that do a fantastic job as well. So we're glad to be here and glad to provide that information. And anyone who's interested in learning more can go to our website at mountainstatespolicy.org.
All right. Chris Cargill, Mountain States Policy Center. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brian. Glad to do it.